Welcome back, traveler. We're going to be reviewing another book, but today's book is slightly different. This book is non-fiction, something that I usually don't review. Today we're going to be looking at Stephen King's On Writing. Now, the funny thing about Stephen King is I've never read any of it, but this was gifted to me by my lovely partner on my birthday. It's a book I've seen in the bookshop quite a few times, heard a lot of people talking about it, asking whether it's worth reading or not, but when it landed in my lap on my birthday, I thought, I've got to read it at some point. So this review is going to be looking at what I learned from it, what I enjoyed about it, and hopefully we'll be able to share some information to you, whether you want to read it or not, maybe just give you the highlights. I'm not going to do a spoiler full version because there's nothing really to spoil, but I'll give the overview and then go into details if you do want to read it by yourselves without me giving too much away. But definitely, so far, worth reading. Let's get into it. So obviously, it being non-fiction, I can't really break down the story into characters, plot, prose, all that shenanigans. So I'm going to talk really broadly about how it's broken down, the different chapters there are in it, and what I've really learned. If you have heard people say that it's more of a memoir, they're partly correct. It's not entirely a memoir. There is a good part of it that is. Now, just to flick through, this is broken down into a few parts. Part 1 is called CV, which is the story of Stephen King as a child, growing up, getting married, entering adulthood, the story of how he really became a writer, the influences on his life, and what sort of inspired him to become a writer and why he writes. The second part is what he calls his toolbox, general ideas of what every writer needs in order to be ready to embark on the writing journey. The next part is the chunkiest and probably the most interesting for fledgling writers, which is On Writing and his tips and tricks, his ways about going through the writing process, talking about his shortcomings, his enjoyment of writing, and what you can do in order to be the best that you can be, which I will be going into details about at the end of the video. There are two later parts to it. There's sort of another part of a memoir where something happens that literally starts him from writing this book, which I found quite profound, but really interesting, and definitely worth reading. After the three main parts, he has further entries, which he calls And Furthermore, parts 1, 2, and 3. The first part is called Door Shut, Door Open, which I will go into more details about later, but he shows you an unedited piece of writing for you to look through and identify the issues with, and then he shows how he edits, literally using pen through paper, crossing out words, adding other words, and explaining how he goes about it, which I found quite interesting and a just nice way of identifying his own process. The last few sections of the book are basically just reading lists, different books that he's read over the decades, because this book was written in 1999, published in 2000, 2001. So you might think it's kind of dated. It's still relevant. Writers are writers, whether they were alive 100 years ago or born today. Things change, technology changes, but at the core of it, writers are writers, and they will go through similar processes. And the very, very last part is an interview with his son, who is also a writer, who wrote Lock and Key, that's on Netflix. I'll begin by saying what I liked and disliked about the book generally before I really go into the details of the things I feel are important to share if you want to read this book or not. I will be able to talk a bit about prose, because it being non-fiction, a sort of a memoir, it's something that I'm not used to. I'm used to reading either quite sort of modern fantasy or archaic fantasy. For the most part, fantasy is written in this laborious, elaborate way, and reading someone expressing themselves, sort of a train of thought kind of thing, I found it kind of jarring. So reading the first 10-15 pages, I found his tone kind of grating. I'm not used to reading American narrators speaking from their heart, and I found his expression kind of choppy, not very clear. it kind of annoyed me. However, as I continued reading, eventually I felt like it was just meeting with a friend. I'd pick the book up and sort of keep that conversation going. Oh, so tell me what happened next. And oh, what kind of tips do you have on writing? The book became so easy to read and so clear in the way he described his tips and his advice that just felt like I had a companion, a writing buddy on my journey through this book, just helping me, holding me by the hand and showing me the ropes. So I found that really lovely and kind of misreading the way he writes. Generally, I really enjoy the book. I think that even if you're not a writer, it's worth reading because he's lived a fascinating life, going through some really menial jobs, but looking at the inspirations for these stories and how he's put them together and the people who've helped him along the way is incredible. And anybody who just is interested in writing or in literature or just the process of putting together a novel will find this interesting. Now, I'm going to dip into some of the advice that he shares. Sorry, Stephen, I'm sure that I'm not spoiling too much, but these are the things that I took away. These are the highlights that I thought were the most important, and I'm here to share them with you, dear viewer. The first thing that I found really useful about reading this book was I found a lot of the things that he was saying reassuring. Writing, as a lot of people say, including Stephen King, is that writing can be the loneliest job. You're sitting by yourself, not sure if you're doing something well, if you're not. And sometimes you question your life. I've questioned myself a lot too, thinking, am I doing the right thing? You often start thinking about whether you should be doing more in your actual life, maybe making more money, chasing that paycheck, or do you sit back and go, actually, I can survive with maybe less money, but to focus on your writing and really chase that dream. It's a lot to think about. So the one thing that I really liked about Stephen King was that it was reassurance. The way he spoke about, at one point, stepping down and focusing on his writing, less about work, was reassuring. Something as well that I've mentioned in a previous video is that being a teacher, a lot of people think you've got loads of time, you can use your holidays to do writing. Stephen King was a high school teacher who taught creative writing and a few other things similar to me. And the fact he says that you come back from work exhausted, you've used all of that mental energy, that you don't have time or energy or patience to sit down and keep working. So that was one thing that I was like, thanks, Stephen. Makes me feel a bit better about myself. He mentions a lot about as well having doubts, getting stuck on books. He mentions a lot about getting stuck halfway through The Stand, which again is this epic-sized novel, which I think probably is the one I might want to read, and literally putting it aside for 30 or 40 years. And that again is reassuring that you think even these people who can blast out books in less than a year. I think he writes his books in about 6 weeks. I think he said 6 or 8 weeks, which is absurd. I think that's what he said. It might be 6 months. I can't remember. But it's reassuring to know that everyone who's writing, no matter at what level, how professional you are, how much money you're making, we're all in the same position. We all get stuck. We all get writer's block. We all dread sometimes coming back to that one scene or that one character, and we doubt, So that was reassuring. Right, onto the tips that he's mentioned that I think are valuable, that I took away, that I want to share. So he talks a lot about this open and closed door. And I think this is a really nice metaphor. It's a really good visualization of how to write. And he says the first draft should be done with the door closed. Now, it can be literal. Literally, you close the door, everybody knows you're writing, do not disturb, turn your phone off, avoid all distractions. When he also means about the closed door, he means that it's only you. You focus on how you're meant to tell the story with no outside influence. You start from beginning to end, you blast it out, you complete the work in isolation, literally and figuratively. Once you've done the first draft, he mentions to wait about 6 weeks. He says, put it away, lock it in a drawer, do something completely different, write something new, change genre, or whatever it is. Then he mentions about opening the door. And when he says opening the door, share it with friends you can trust. He mentions his wife quite a lot, how he trusts her inside and out. He knows that her opinion he will value. And then share it with the world, share it with friends, listen to their feedback. Something that I've also noticed, and I've given some other people advice too, is that if one or two people mention one or two things that they might not like, forget it. He says a lot of forget about it. Ignore them. When 3 or 4 or 5 plus people begin mentioning or criticizing the same thing, then you got to start taking notes and thinking, actually, maybe this is a problem. Maybe I need to change that. So he mentions that. And so the open door is when you invite criticism in, you listen to other people's feedback, and then you can begin the second draft, the third draft, etc. And then you polish it down. And I've gotten to the stage where I can show friends my work and listen to their feedback and not get too distracted with thinking, oh no, I've got to go back and edit that. Once upon a time, I did do that. I would show people my opening and they go, I don't like this, you should change that. And I'd suddenly spend the next 3 weeks rewriting the opening so it pleased people. Don't do that. Write for you. On the point of his wife, he also mentions that you should have a specific reader in mind. And I love this idea. He says he writes for his wife. If she's happy, then everything's okay. Especially as genre writers, we need to be thinking about the kind of audience that we're targeting. He mentions about, you can't please everybody. You're not writing for massive audiences because you can't please everybody. And this is something that we have to remember as writers. A few small things he mentions are things like, don't write for money, don't write for acclaim, write for yourself. Think about the enjoyment that you get, the goals that you want to achieve. But if you're trying to please people, you're trying to, chase that paycheck with writing, you're in the wrong industry. He mentions about word count, something I've also mentioned in one of my previous videos. And interestingly enough, he says that he hits that 2,000 word cap every day. I'm sure that obviously life gets in the way sometimes, but 2,000 words is his goal. Someone who's written usually about 1,000. It's gone down a little bit since my last video. I was writing about 1,500, but it's gone down to 1,000. I'm happy with 1,000. I am now trying to push myself to write at least 1,500, if not more. And it's difficult, but he suggests, especially if you've just started, 1,000 words a day, hit that, perfect. If you're finding that difficult, set it to 800. Bring it down, but write to you, but be consistent. My new goal is try to do 2,000 words a day, just to be like Stephen King. Something really interesting he mentions about editing is this one person who gave him feedback when he was publishing short stories in magazines, and he said that it was only it was like a line long, but it was some of the best feedback he ever had. And it goes something along the lines of, editing is cutting 10%. If it's 1,000, I'm not very good at maths. If it's 1,000, cut it down to 900. But generally, you don't want to be increasing as you're editing. You don't want to add scenes. You want to make it shorter. You want to streamline. Something else he mentions very briefly is that, seeking an agent. Now, there's a passage on seeking an agent, how to do it, which I don't think he goes into a huge amount of detail, and I didn't find that very helpful. But yeah, so looking for agents, he mentions that not all agents are good agents. Some agents will take your money, and you should never pay for an agent. They should represent you in order to make money. But as you know, any writer who's just begun might be desperate for an agent, and don't say yes. And if you do say yes and you realize they're crooks or they're not good or they're trying to change your views, you can say no. You can turn an agent down and keep looking. Never jump the gun and jump for the first agent that says yes. Make sure that they're representing you and that you are comfortable working with them, because it's meant to be a partnership. Something I noticed as well in his journey to becoming an author, and something that he mentions about when you're reaching out for agents, is publish things beforehand. Find magazines that will accept short stories. Find websites that will take your work and publish them or show them. Find ways of showing that people have accepted your work, that they're accrediting you, so that when you do go to an agent, you can put that in your cover letter and say, by the way, people have responded, I've gained money from this, or I've won this competition, and that will give you more credibility when you are looking for an agent in order to get one. This is something that I'm working on, but at the moment I'm so fixated on finishing my book that is now 320,000 words. It's going to end up about 400, but I want to finish this, and once I've done that, I'll take my 6-week break and write some short stories and start submitting them. Some smaller things, he mentions in this toolbox too that there are some basic rules about it. He talks about the layers of a toolbox. And in the top one, it's grammar, spelling, punctuation, just the basics. You need to know how to write. Don't just assume that your editor, line editor is going to correct everything. That's what they're there for, but they're not there to, make your writing as professional as you could already do. So there were some other ones, the next layer was about style, about how to blah, blah, blah. That bit didn't really captivate me. It wasn't very clear either. It doesn't go into detail, but he just talks about basic things about, understanding how to put together strong writing. One of the things he mentions is he said, she said. I think Kurt Vonnegut mentions this as well. Avoid using he whispered or he exclaimed. Just stick to he said, she said. Keep it simple. Now, that's something that I don't do in my writing. I like the archaic, slightly Victorian. So it's something I'm going to think about in my editing process, but at the moment, I'm going to keep it. Something that he goes on about loads and loads too is to avoid adverbs. He says adverbs kill prose. If you're describing how things are done, there are better ways of doing it. Be as concise as you can. There's probably a verb that you can use that will summarize that rather than adding adverbs. He says it makes it sound sort of childish, it's lazy. It's also, he talks about it being cowardly because we're afraid, maybe they're not going to understand it. So we put that in to comfort us and we think the reader, but be brave. The only time he says that you can use it is if you're being ironic. Really small tip, he says, if you want to be a writer, read lots, write lots. Something that I've really taken on board, after my sort of teenage years was, if you want to be a writer, read. Read everything, read as much as you can. Now, Stephen King apparently reads tons. And in the back of the book, you can see all the lists of books that he's read over each decade. He says to bring a book everywhere. Always have a book on the go. He even brings books to baseball games, and one of his friends found that hilarious. Always be thirsty for more reading, and it's something that I'm really trying to practice doing. Now, on to the thing that I found was the most important and the most useful in terms of my own writing, but I think generally it was the one thing that had the most impact when I think about how to write and telling stories. He says stories and novels consist of three main things. The first one is narration. And that's however you do it, whether it's first person, third person, but that's how you get the story from A to Z. That's you telling the story. The second one is description. And that he describes as being the way to make the world feel more real. The immersive qualities, what you hear, what you smell, what you see, bringing that world to life, bringing your reader on that journey. Again, thinking about what to describe and how to describe it, that would be a whole other video. The last one he says is the main component is dialogue, the way that you bring your characters to life. You show who they are, how they interact. The interesting thing he says immediately after these 3 points, he says there is no plot. Plot is something that should be avoided potentially. Again, depends on the kind of writer you are. He says that he'll have a general idea. When he starts writing a story like Carrie, he thought about girl having, getting bullied, having her period, and then he mixed it with pseudoscience about telekinesis. He married those two ideas together and ran with a story. Something he says about plot is that very often you can get stuck in trying to make things fit into the plot. This is something I'm struggling at the moment with too. I have my story, I know exactly how it pans out, but the moment that you get to that point and you're trying to make the pieces fit, you can get stuck on trying to force the characters and force the story and find convenient and sometimes coincidental events to happen in order for you to follow that plot. He mentions quite a few times about letting your characters take the wheel. I've read on forums where writers will say, oh, my character decided to do this, or they said that and I wasn't expecting it, and I've always rolled my eyes. But he mentions it as well, where sometimes you let your characters have natural reactions, play out the scenes how they would, rather than you go, they have to start here, they're going to end here, this is how he's going to react. Let your characters live and breathe, because that's what makes writing organic. Another tip that he mentions is that a lot of people say, write what you know. He thinks as well as I do that that's a stupid thing to say, especially people who write science fiction and fantasy, horror, whatever it might be. How can you write about, other worlds or space travel or what it's like to fight a dragon? You can't, right? That's crazy. But he says, be true to yourself. If you love romantic comedies, write that. If you love action thrillers, write that. I think that's about all I can ramble about. I would say, though, that, this book is really worth reading, really quick. And something that I'm also going to do, I'm probably going to do another video next, is my reading list. But it's so easy to read. And also, I loved very few books are like this. I picked it up and I thought, oh, it's really cheap, but it's like silk. I love this. So I've really enjoyed reading this. Might pick up some Stephen King at some point, but has it helped me understand writing? Yeah, a little bit. It helps me be more confident with how I'm writing. Definitely made me think about how I'm going to edit my book, what I'm going to trim, what I'm going to add or take away. So I found it really useful. And again, I'd give it, I'd give it again 4 out of 5. Good read. Until the next time, safe travels.